One reason for the Constitution's success is that by 1787, Americans had behind them long experience in self-government. They had experienced both governmental success and failure. They had successfully emerged from dependence on the British Empire and become self-governing, but they failed to avoid a bloody war in the process. This is one reason why a smooth transition of power, particularly presidential power, is critical in America. From the British point of view, however, America was not as valuable as, say, Barbados because it produced sugar, and India because of its cotton. These were the real moneymakers. Thus, colonial Americans were given less attention than other British colonies and therefore inadvertently allowed more autonomy. Sometimes this permissiveness was intentional on the British government's part, such as when the English king empowered the settlers in the colony of tobacco-growing Virginia to establish a representative assembly in Jamestown. But in New England, a form of self-government came about somewhat by accident. Puritans aboard the Mayflower intended to land in territory under the Virginia Company's jurisdiction, but instead came ashore at Plymouth in Massachusetts. Being outside the Virginia Company's jurisdiction, the Puritans drew up their own governing document called the Mayflower Compact. In this compact, the signers agreed to live under the colony's recognized authority and wait for a royal charter similar to Virginia's. In the Mayflower Compact, we see the emergence of two important concepts: government by consent and a willingness to live under the rule of law. Ironically, another way in which Americans learned to be self-governing was by breaking laws. In an effort to keep the wealth of the British Empire within the empire, the British government passed navigation acts that sharply restricted American trade with the Dutch, French, and Spanish. The restrictions of the Navigation Acts of 1651 and 1660, which aimed to restrict the colonists' trade with the Dutch and therefore keep as much wealth as possible in British hands, favored Britain, but were not so beneficial to American merchants. Many Americans either ignored the laws or did not comply with them completely, finding loopholes. Because Britain had a global empire on its hands by the mid-1700s, the Americans were essentially left alone. They got used to governing themselves for the most part. The Americans really benefited from what's referenced to as Britain's salutary neglect. Following the costly French and Indian War in America from 1754 to 1763, the era of salutary neglect was over, and differing views of colonists' contributions to the war soured relations between Britain and the colonists. The colonists felt that they had contributed greatly to victory, despite brutal and disrespectful treatment from British troops. On the other hand, the British complained that the colonists had contributed little and even undermined their efforts by smuggling French goods. So what emerged out of the French and Indian War was the growing differences between Britain and the colonies. And at the same time, the French and Indian War ushered in a period of economic depression in both Britain and in the colonies. The war had doubled England's national debt, laying the groundwork for conflict over taxation between Britain and the colonies. At the same time the colonists were being taxed, they lost some of their wartime revenue, such as wartime contracts like shipbuilding, and in addition, high prices for necessities such as salt and candles had not really declined after the war. Britain looked to America to extract whatever money it could to help pay its war debt by enacting a series of legislation. In 1764, the British enacted the Sugar Act, which extended the Revenue Acts by forcing ship captains and merchants to fill out extensive paperwork in the hope that it would cut illicit trade. It established admiralty courts in which smugglers would be tried without the benefit of a jury of their peers. Most importantly, it affirmed the right of the British government to tax any property it wished by imposing a 3 pence per gallon tax on molasses, because an early molasses tax had not been enforced. The first small non-importation movement was the result, meaning some colonists boycotted English imports. It did not last long, but it showed that colonists would band together publicly against political acts that they disagreed with. Another key act was the Quartering Act of 1765. It required that colonists either supply and quarter British Army troops in public buildings and taverns, or build barracks for them. On the heels of these acts, from 1765 to 1770, came the Stamp Act, the Townsend duties, the Boston Massacre, and the Tea Act. Together, these important acts and events convinced the colonists that the British government was set on depriving them of their rights to life, liberty, and property. The Stamp Act of 1765 required colonists to purchase special stamps for virtually every piece of paper, playing cards, newspapers, contracts, wills, you name it, that circulated in the colonies. With this act, Parliament had imposed its first serious internal tax, one that affected colonists' daily exchange of goods and services. It had far greater consequences than the Sugar Act because it affected a greater number of people, and this unleashed widespread aggravation throughout the colonies. In New York City, a group of merchants formed the Sons of Liberty, and chapters spread throughout the colonies, joining middling colonists at the middle income level who wanted to have a greater say in political affairs with elite colonists who wanted to control these protests. The Sons of Liberty organized more non-importation boycotts. At this point, 8 out of the 13 colonies protested Britain's right to tax the colonies. Charles Townsend became prime minister in 1767, and he was hoping to appease the colonists, but he assigned taxes to international, not internal trade to do so. And this did the opposite. Taxing imports like tea, paper, lead, glass, and paint would cause an even greater financial burden to fall on the colonists. On March 5th, 1770, as Lord North, yet another new prime minister, asked Parliament for a partial repeal of the Townsend duties, British troops killed 5 civilians in Boston, including Crispus Attucks, an African American, in what became known as the Boston Massacre. The Boston Massacre had been a long time coming. Not only were Bostonians forced to quarter about 1,700 soldiers in their city of 18,000, but the soldiers in their redcoats flaunted their authority and picked fights on the streets, especially after they had been out drinking in the taverns. Even worse, the soldiers were not on duty or allowed to compete with Bostonians for scarce jobs. And Bostonians had been suffering through difficult economic times for 70 years before 1760. To protest the Tea Act, on the evening of December 16, 1773, a mob of about 50 young men, disguised as tomahawks or Mohawk Native Americans, they heaved 45 tons or 10,000 pounds sterling worth of tea into Boston Harbor, while thousands watched in the moonlight. Taxes such as these led to the rallying cry, "No taxation without representation." The American colonies were not represented across the Atlantic Ocean in the British Parliament. The colonists believed that government should govern only with consent of the people. Remember to do your readings and watch this video again and carefully answer your questions.